Almost a year ago to the day, I was scripting Payday 3 Blew Me Away and the other assorted Payday 3 sneak peek videos after enjoying some Swedish hospitality courtesy of Starbreeze at their studio in Stockholm. With the embargo lifted, it kickstarted the cycle of pre-release content that was, aside for some well-founded doubts about always online stipulations, broadly positive and full of genuine excitement. Come the day of full launch, I was left looking rather daft. Quite rightly, critics of mine have reminded me of those videos, the naivety with which I approached the game, and my inability to spot the pitfalls that seem so obvious in hindsight. I don't want to make excuses for these failings. There were lots of factors at play, but if you bought the game after hearing the positivity I shared from my initial impression, and are now frustrated with that purchase, I sincerely apologise. I got a lot wrong, and didn't have the experience with the game to share such glowing reviews. I should have erred on the side of caution, and have learned a lot from these mistakes. But that's enough about me. There's another party that needs to be learning from its mistakes at an even more expedient rate. Starbreeze have to burn the rot away or face utter oblivion. They might be cash liquid as of May 2024, but turning over losses again just 2 quarters since Payday 3's launch was surely not in the plans. I don't think in the modern gaming landscape that they're guaranteed to have the steam to make it to Project Baxter's completion and the next Payday, shall we say. With the gaming industry seeming more cutthroat and heartless by the day, it's an even scarier landscape to traverse. So it all really comes down to making this game that they have in Payday 3 as much of a success as possible. That isn't a plea for more reorganisation within the company. I actually have faith that internal resources are being reasonably well managed, and the ongoing development of Payday 3 is being prioritised. No, it's about fixing what is preventing Payday 3 from being the success its franchise power and innate concept should allow it to be. The fundamentals of game design that have led to players slipping through the cracks since day one. Because at the end of the day, Operation Meditbag could be a tremendous success in terms of hitting all of those essential talking points for the game, of offline, functioning matchmaking and social features, but even then, it'll just be a working shell. It still won't have the core elements that made its predecessor the historic success it was, and still won't retain a player base as a result. So, as penance for my jumping the gun in praise of Payday 3 last June, I'm going to crawl across the glass of the game's shakiest systems that also happen to be the linchpins of it becoming a successful title in the long term, to work out what can be done to save it from earning a spot on Death of a Game. There's a ton of room for criticising Starbreeze's decision making and overall attitude to Payday 3. Cost-cutting likely neutered its launch, unlearned lessons of console inexperience have stunted its update progress, and a misread of recent Payday 2 success has led to an anemic, overpriced content drip feed in the months that have followed. However, I want this video to be constructive and avoid pointing fingers, so the focus will be purely on what needs to change and how, not really labelling the point of why it was a bad idea in the first place. Also, I do want to note that some of Payday 3's framework already does a stellar job. Animations, weapon feel, general combat responsiveness, and its core stealth mechanics all landed excellently and make up the primary reasons why those first few hours of gameplay do feel enjoyable before the rot sets in. Whilst highly subjective, I also think the music of the game is up to the high bar set by its predecessor, and visually I think Payday 3 does fine for itself, although find to suffer from overly generic environments and lack an individual style, which isn't exactly helping matters. But regardless, these aspects, features and mechanics of the game do not need overhauling and should instead be built upon moving forwards. Yes, that means I think everything I haven't already mentioned does need an almost complete overhaul, so buckle in. It's going to be a wild and potentially divisive ride through the 6 main categories of gameplay that Payday 3 needs to seriously reevaluate if it wants to grow into a success to be spoken of in the same breath as Payday 2. Let's start with its all-important arsenal of lead-slinging weapons. Since day one, Payday 3's weapon selection has been more limiting than what we've come to expect from the series. Secondaries being limited to pistols and revolvers was a step backwards, whilst launching with multiple legacy weapon types and variants missing from the game was also a mistake. Akimbo, explosive and incendiary being shelved hurts, especially when they also happen to be some of the most popular weapon types from Payday 2, all having their own supporting skills and playstyles. Live services have a bad habit of taking regressive steps and then going, but we developed that over years, which I don't really buy into. Elden Ring was a massive evolution of the Dark Souls formula, and it's not as if they decided to skimp out on the weapon variety as a result. Beyond us losing access to some of our favourite guns, there's also the issue of how the ones we have are balanced. Basically, the way skills exist in the game, and bearing in mind cop count is lower in Payday 3, one-shot kills have become the ultimate way to play, resulting in clear meta options for each category, with the likes of the VF7S and SA being head and shoulders above everything else. Recent changes to cutting shot weren't a great idea from an overall game balance perspective, but at least it brought a little more weapon variety to the game, with new one-shot kill options being promoted up. I don't necessarily think this is an issue of weapon design and balance, but more so tied to how combat plays out in Payday 3 and the skills that have floated to the top. If there was more skill support for bullet hose guns and lower health but more swarmy enemy types, the spray and pray SMGs and weaker ARs might start to see more play, even without being directly tweaked. Unfortunately, I also think the weapon progression system and attachments that go along with it just don't really work. I think challenges, especially those related to weapon kills, would have worked much better here than they ever could for account leveling, instead of weapons just arbitrarily leveling up even if you don't really use them. When you do reach the max level on a weapon and want to fully deck it out, despite my initial assertions to the contrary, it's basically a shot in the dark as to what each attachment is going to do to your weapon, and at the end of the day, an unmodified gun ends up feeling frighteningly similar to one that's fully decked out in expensive C-stat modifications. These problems are at least easy to get on top of. Weapon information needs to be conveyed more directly, so that means a return of understandable numerical stats. We need access to more attachments for almost every gun, which impact how weapons handle more aggressively, and we need an on-the-fly shooting gallery to be able to actively edit weapon setups and test them out for direct and instant comparison. Most of the time at the moment, I'll change my weapon attachments, but will have no frame of reference, as I won't remember what it felt like without them. Again, secondaries also need to be properly evaluated. We've gone from wielding 3 separate weapon types in Payday the Heist, to 2 highly varied primary and secondaries in Payday 2, to what amounts to 1 main weapon with a dinky sidearm that gets forgotten in Payday 3. It's another strange regression that allows for less build and playstyle expression, and serves no gameplay purpose other than limiting the fun that we can have. Another example of resetting to default launch Payday 2 levels of ambition and hoping no one would mind after we'd gotten used to something altogether better over the past 9 years. Simply adding unique ammo types could go a long way in varying weapon customization and would be a simple step in a positive direction without having to model numerous new weapons. Even more important to the successful Payday formula than our arsenal of lethal weapons are the game's heists. Across the 11 we have in the game currently, they really are the epitome of Mio's comment regarding the game being hard to learn, easy to master. Payday 3 can be quite abrasive at times in how it teaches mechanics. I remember the sheer information overload I was struck with when first testing out Under the Surface, but after a few successful attempts, it's very easy to gain complete mastery over any heist as you quickly learn its layout and fixed objective spawns by heart, making every run almost identical. There's nothing that will throw you off. Most heists basically have 2 starting spawn points, 2 likely objective variations, and 2 escape locations, with a possibility of some true randomization in terms of keypad codes, but little else. With most other heist elements being stationary, there's very limited variation between heist experiences, which is a cardinal sin when there are only 11 heists in total and the entirety of their replay value comes down to seriously enjoying the stealth or loud gameplay loop. How they thought they could get away with this, I will never know, when its 10-year-old predecessor had more sophisticated RNG built in on launch. Different entry and escape methods, not just locations, varying objective types that could require completely different tactics to properly manage, and randomized loot quantities, locations and variants, so that even your reward felt unique to that specific run. Payday 3 needs all of this and more if it's ever going to step out of Payday 2's shadow. Whilst they're at it, I think I'd be inclined to remove seeded runs, which fixes the RNG of any heist whenever you restart, as this trivializes them after a failed attempt, resulting in even more samey experiences and capping the game's difficulty far lower than experienced players should enjoy. One excellent point I've seen made is that heists have gone from multi-act set pieces to single-act romps with no clear direction. There's room in the game for both styles of heist. Harvest and Trustee was hardly an expansive epic, instead scratching an itch for that rucky heist fantasy. But we need some level of variety and ambition here. It's really simple to think of if you consider Payday 2 and its 3-act experiences. Obviously 3-Day Heist exemplified this the best. We have the cook, the trade, and the ambush on something like Rats. It's a self-contained narrative that keeps you engaged throughout. But we can see a similar design philosophy as far back as Payday the Heist. The chase, the holdout, and the escape on Heat Street. Heist flow, you move throughout environments, and your goals in each moment are very distinct and hold your attention. Payday 3's best heists have glimmers of this concept. In No Rest for the Wicked, we have the Thermite, the Vault, and the Escape. You progress through the objectives with a logical purpose and move to differing environments offering distinct challenges. Syntax Error also kinda gets this concept across. But most other heists in the game completely lack that feeling of narrative consistency and a progressive mission structure. Road Rage, for example, is completely linear and offers you the same challenge across its duration. Touch the Sky understands that it needs to keep you on your toes with solid objective design that moves you around the heist, but it all takes place in such a tight space that it sometimes feels farcical. As I've said before, heists in Payday 3 either end right as they're about to get interesting, or start after the interesting part has already happened. Imagine actually playing out the Road Rage escape and abseiling down the bridge, or forcing your way into the Touch the Sky penthouse like we did in Mountain Master. It would create a much more complete and compelling experience, giving us a little more insight into the gang's methods and allowing for so many more set-piece moments, which are the foundations of the Payday series, don't forget. More generally, we obviously need some greater objective variety. I do believe that drills had utility over Wi-Fi circles, but in general I think there are lots of ways they could innovate with objectives. Just look to the post-White House era of Payday 2, where we slowly moved away from relying on the same old failsafes and started to experiment with driving cars through walls and complex pipe-turning puzzles. Payday 3 has nothing even close to that level of ambition, or that builds so well around heist-to-heist randomization, so until we've seen it, all I can do is keep asking for future heists to take notes. Moving on to skills, I probably sound like a broken record at this point, but I don't believe the flat single point system works for skill design. It's led to severe imbalance, uniform meta builds, and a complete lack of specialization and roleplaying. Not only is it impossible to balance over 100 separate skills with each other, it's also a bad idea to try, as it means skills should only be as interesting as their least ambitious concept. As new skill lines are added, the system just gets more bloated, and let's be honest, new skills have either been must-haves or frankly useless. It's not a scalable system, and I can't understand why they've complicated it so much for themselves. Edge, Grit and Rush are fine, but tying most interesting skills to one or multiple of these buffs has led to frustrating and micromanagey playstyles that take the shine off the actual core gameplay. Spamming reload, dropping and picking up bags or standing still for a few seconds just results in stunted and unnatural gameplay, not helped by all buffs being on a 15-second timer. If you're playing with the system as intended, you'll always feel on edge, pardon the pun. Personally, I'd switch up to more generalized trees with some weapon and playstyle specific branches, and I'd remove Edge, Grit and Rush in favour of bespoke buffs that are more internalized within a conceptual playstyle, like how Fortitude builds around the adrenaline mechanic. Berserker in Payday 2 is a good skill because it grants damage in exchange for playing with a reduced health pool. It's an active trade-off that needs to be monitored but not constantly babysat. As it functions in Payday 3 right now, we get damage boosts for something as non-committal as simply switching weapons, so the risk reward isn't really present. It means everything is splashable on any build, and optimal skills float to the top. I believe skills in general have to be less frustrating to activate, but more engaging to wield. If we take a look at the current system in a bit more depth, there are essentially 4 types of skill. Meta but boring, meta and fun, conceptually cool but irrelevant, and generally useless. I'd fix this by removing the useless skills entirely and attaching them to other more moderately viable skills to create something potentially worth using. I'd look into what makes the conceptually cool skills difficult to utilise and streamline their stipulations to increase their applicability in most situations. Meta skills that are fun should generally be left untouched or developed and built upon with more supportive skills to accentuate what is already a fun and proven playstyle. Meta skills that are boring should either be added as base mechanics that all heisters have access to, as their viability, despite not being fun, speaks volumes about the game's wider systems, or also attached to weaker but more interesting skills in order to create more balanced hybrids that retain their viability but involve more active actions to hopefully make them more enjoyable to use. Skills like Ammo Funnel and Replenish serve as perfect examples. These are prime, fun and viable options with actual external synergies with skills like Plate Up and Mag Throw. Naturally, they've become must-haves on almost every build with virtually no drawbacks to speak of. Instead of nerfing these core skills though, which has undoubtedly gone through the balance team's minds, I'd look to streamline and develop the playstyle to accentuate it as an aggressive damage-focused setup. Create new skills that synergize with long-distance ammo pickups to encourage greater investment in this style of build. You could even take it a step further by making it so that chaining kills together without reloading makes you even stronger or more resilient, but manually reloading removes or reduces the potency of the buffs to enforce it as an actual skill-based style of play. Not only can they make it so you have to commit to this sort of skill combo and make trade-offs to do so as effectively as possible, with more solid synergistic skills, you wouldn't be so inclined to just run every defensive meta skill, and be a jack of all trades without making sacrifices. Ultimately, I believe you can make the effects of one of the most potent skill combos in the game even stronger, but then balance it by requiring greater commitment to use as a distinct playstyle, limiting its infinite versatility by encouraging players to buy into it fully to get the most out of it. Next, this is an area of Payday 3 that's obviously close to my heart. My take is that Payday 3's story feels ashamed of the lore it created in Payday 2. They don't have to acknowledge too much of the crazy Kataru narrative, but the fact that Bane and the intervening years after Payday 2 ended have hardly been mentioned is unforgivable, really. The storyline build-up from the Lost Tapes was basically blown in the first 8 heists, and didn't have the intrigue to carry the launch story any further. It's been shocking seeing all these bit part characters from more obscure DLC packs like City of Gold and Texas Heat find their way back into the narrative, and I can't shake the feeling that this wasn't a convenience and cost-saving move. I love Blaine Keegan's voice work, but does he contract Touch the Sky because it's worthwhile world building, or does he do it because they had him doing lines for Crude Awakening already? What's ended up happening is we have this very diluted pool of contractors who say their paragraphs before and after heists, and then disappear off into the abyss, while Shade screams instructions at us for everything else. And I mean, how can we have a functional sequel when no one cares about these new characters? Pearl is underdeveloped and dropped into the gang without context. Shade completely lacks the intrigue Bane had as the gang's handler, and seriously, who the hell is Beckett? But more important than these new guys, the returning characters haven't been done the justice they deserve. The core heisters are fine in presentation, I like their voice work, but they're very insular, only interacting in stunted sentences during cutscenes, leading to loads of wasted potential. Payday's most marketable feature is its core gang of heisters, but I think that's all credit in the bank. No one's falling in love with these shadows of past glory, they're just nostalgic for the heisters that were built up over the past decade. Infuriatingly, the returning non-playable contractors have somehow been treated even worse. They're back for pure familiarity and nostalgia value. Their personalities have been muted, and their roles within the wider story are completely non-existent. That's not even touching on the fact I don't think it was in good taste to bring back the Butcher with a new voice actress without a good reason for doing so. It feels pretty indefensible without a key narrative explanation. But that's the crux of the issue. The narrative feels like it's mostly playing out off-screen, with very little being actively explained to the player. It's all the promise of learning where the other heisters are, what happened to Locke, who's Concord, and why should I care? That isn't enough to keep most players invested, which is a shame, because I know at least towards the climax of the White House, the story was doing a lot of heavy lifting in keeping the community hooked on new content. If they want to take steps to reverse this issue, the narrative needs to be properly threaded through heists, instead of them all feeling so disembodied. Contractors need to take a more active role in the storytelling, and there just needs to be a more interesting hook to the overarching narrative, because as it stands, I don't see how they'll ever match the intrigue of adding the dentist to Payday 2. It's a less prominent issue than the other categories I've discussed, but Payday 3's armor and survivability mechanics still need reconsidering. Of course, the original armor design punishes any form of aggression permanently, with its fighting game-esque chip damage that I just don't think works for this sort of experience. It tends to just lead to frustration or passivity, which Payday's never been about. Adaptive armor has fixed this to some extent, and opened up a new, more aggressive playstyle that most players online seem to have gravitated towards. It has contributed to what's making the game so easy, but I honestly think adrenaline and resource abundance are more so the culprits of imbalance in the grand scheme of things. I believe the armor system should be developed from this positive step, rather than fully redesigned from the ground up, with each lining type getting its own pros and cons, and functioning like mini, all-inclusive perk decks. Heavier armors could retain the degradation mechanics if they were also paired with nice Helldivers-inspired bonuses, allowing you to maybe start with greater ammo or throwable reserves, or even carry additional armor repair kits with you from the start of a heist to replenish that armor manually. Other armor types might give you buffs to team play mechanics, allowing you to revive teammates faster or even focus down objectives, whilst one-plate setups could look to lean into dodge or even glass cannon mechanics. Imagine a one-plate armor type that grants some bullet deflection chance when active, i.e. dodge, but then buffs your movement and reload speeds when destroyed, so there's an actual incentive to play armorless and take some risks. I feel like there's so much untapped potential in the Payday 3 armor system that would allow for creative builds and more specialised playstyles, instead of it being an arbitrary bar that staves off death and acts like a doomsday timer for every heist. Adrenaline, health builds and the Fortitude skill line have been an excellent step in this, and whilst I do think it's fairly overpowered right now, it's a solid platform to build from to encourage more unique playstyles in the future, giving the standard lining a new lease of life, which the other base armor types desperately need too. Touching on our adversaries, the SWATs, they're just as important an ingredient to the overall gameplay experience as the heisters themselves. It's worth mentioning that I was naively excited by the new and returning enemy types in Payday 3 prior to launch. I think a genuinely excellent development was the choice to give most of them active weak points to change how heisters can approach each of them. Sadly, from an effectiveness perspective, outside of cloakers, who are basically the only check in the game to ultra tanky health builds at the moment, they are too few and far between, and much too passive in using their anti-heister mechanics. Think about Grenadiers, a generally popular addition with cool adaptive mechanics in their flashbangs and gas grenades. Let me ask you, how often do you see them going up in smoke before even getting a chance to toss out a grenade? Zappers are even worse, they hardly seem to tase you, and their shock mines are a slight inconvenience at best. These guys need to be a threat, so I'd be inclined to up their aggressiveness, develop tactics for them where they attempt to ambush you at choke points, or set up mines on specific high traffic locations, say next to tied up civilians. As for Grenadiers, they probably need to use their gas more actively instead of just throwing it in the heister's general direction. What if they aim to gas out choke points, even if heisters aren't around, allowing them to funnel you into specific areas of the heist? I think the foundations of some interesting enemy types are already present, but they desperately need leveling up in their tactical awareness if they're ever going to threaten experienced crews in the numbers they show up in currently. The techie is another point of contention. For the most part, their drones are little more than a suppressive nuisance at this point, and their hiding mechanic is a lot less fun for players than I think the designers anticipated. The potential of a drone unit is interesting, and can vary combat by forcing you to look skyward for once, but having them spawn endlessly until the techie is taken down is more frustrating than it is fun. Personally, I'd be inclined to buff her arsenal of drones to make them require the full attention of a team to take down or seek her out to save the effort. But instead of allowing her to just produce these endlessly, I'd suggest programming her to come out of hiding as soon as her drone is dropped and actually join the fray, making her a more active and memorable SWAT unit than she currently is on Syntax Error. Right now, she's more of a distracting minigame and a limitless source of armor repair kits. More generally, I don't think it helps that the appearance of specials is dependent on how far through the heist objectives you currently are. I'd just scrap that mechanic altogether, as I don't think it adds a whole lot and just encourages speedruns of most heists. Instead, I'd allow all enemy types to spawn as soon as the first responders have arrived, but I'd ramp up the spawn caps wave to wave, allowing more of each special to flood the heist as it drags out, upping the challenge similarly, but not limiting the relevance of each special type. As it stands, dozers are pretty nasty, but fairly avoidable even after the mid-wave changes on overkill. Oh, and don't get me started on FBI vans, these things are currently a joke. Either it needs to be harder to hunt down and stay on the move, or be protected in some way, perhaps by a detail of spawning specials who cover its arrival. The final topic I want to touch on is more general combat design. Sadly, enemies spawn in Payday 3 in an even more artificial way than they did in its predecessor. It seems as though the game prioritizes spawns near the player, meaning they'll often just occur right in front of your eyes, adding to that lack of immersion that's so prevalent within Payday 3. Unfortunately, you're just constantly reminded that you're in a video game. In the worst examples of this, such as on Dirty Ice and Touch the Sky, with a half-decent build you can spawn trap 90% of the heist hostiles, and will only need to worry about dealing with cops from one or two directions, simplifying combat and turning the game into a basic damage race. Spawns need to be more varied, and they need to trust their AI to enter the map from further away and actually path towards the player rapidly, instead of just dropping them in on our heads. The use of vehicles like SWAT vans and choppers could really help with this, enabling cops to spawn from otherwise inaccessible locations and actually keep a crew on their toes, whilst also upping the immersion by contextualizing their arrival on the scene. Hell, if they develop this mechanic further with actual vehicle destruction, overkill weapons could see a new lease of life, as they could potentially be used to deal with massive groups of spawning cops in one badass go. Even once they've spawned on the heist though, cops really need to be more effective in how they approach heisters and how they counter the most prevalent strategies. Let's be honest, their poor pathing and lack of tactical awareness means that camping in a single entrance room is pretty much a foolproof strategy, as they just funnel in and take their lumps one by one. This is extra egregious when the Grenadier should be a perfect counter to this, but doesn't have the ability to gas you out without establishing line of sight. Cops need the tactical awareness to force you out of hiding places, or at least have the ability to find and force their way in without just using the one open door. I'd love to see high explosive environmental destruction return, but in a more free-form way, as seen on older heists such as Undercover. Alternatively, if you don't want to camp in a bathroom, the cops can also be utterly bamboozled by just leading them around the heist, as their pathing will always force them to chase shadows. Not only do all SWATs need upgrading pathing logic, they should be able to identify this sort of strategy and deploy countermeasures, such as holding their positions at key choke points or objectives, instead of just chasing heisters around like headless chickens. Hostage rescue and sabotage teams are already the genesis of this idea, so I think they just need to accentuate that behaviour to counter fairly cheesy strategies. Honestly, I actually praise the cops for breaching rooms tactically and pushing as formed units instead of just turning into horde shooter lemmings at launch, but I was so far off in that assessment. I've lost count of the number of times I've just walked up behind an entire group of SWATs, setting up for a big breach, and shot them all in the back of the head without any reaction. Their AI desperately needs to be more adaptive and less stubborn, and they need to start following less predictable patterns, especially until actual objective RNG is properly implemented, as for right now it's only the cops who can throw any curveballs in the first place. So that's my Payday 3 assessment, roughly a year on from the first time my starry-eyed self played the game uncritically. Some of these issues I mentioned but underplayed and hope will be fixed, but here we are, 8 months into full live service and still with a mountain to climb. The content roadmap for Payday 3 I've seen does give me some cause for optimism, but I worry the same intrinsic problems will weigh the game down if not addressed directly, even if the content around it is promising. I'm not sure adding another skill line is going to save us, and if the upcoming DLC heists have the same shallow replayability, incoherent story, and cost an arm and a leg to even try out, I fear the game won't be long for this world. So yeah, some of Payday 3's systems just blow, but I don't think that has to be the case forever, and as the next major update grows near and the beleaguered progression system finally gets overhauled, I think we will see a bit of a shift in public perception, which hopefully Starbreeze sees and rides the high of by tackling other core community complaints. I genuinely have no idea how this is all going to turn out. I'm truly grateful for you guys sticking with me thus far through it all, and promise to stop trying to make fixing Payday 3 videos. It's obviously something I'd love to manifest, but from here on in, I'll just be evaluating the content we do get at face value as we find out if they really can turn things around. However, unlike last year, I'm keeping my lips sealed regarding my gut feeling as to how Payday 3's gonna develop. Thanks so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you all very soon. A huge thank you to my dedicated Patreon backers. If you want to join this crew in going infamous, check out the link below and pledge as little as $2 to see your name in the credits, or get 24-hour early access to future videos and vote on upcoming content. Take care, I'll see you all soon.